we are recording this evening's talk, and thank you very much for all of you who have joined this, the fifth and final lecture in our series on the Edwardians and the context in which Lutyens was working. And tonight we are incredibly fortunate to have Rosie here, the head of collection displays at the National Portrait Gallery for Victorian and Contemporary, and also the senior curator for the 20th century collections, which makes her perfectly placed here to talk about and give us the context in which Lutyens was working in the art world. And I think to many members, they will be familiar of Lutyens' connections with Nicholson, and of course the Doll's House had I think something like 750 pieces of art commissioned for it. However, we are not delving into specific parts of where Lutyens had his connections, but rather wanting to try and set a broader picture of what was going on. And so Rosie will look at that, and she will explain it far better than I will. But as final bits of housekeeping, please put any questions you have in the Q&A at the bottom, which I will try and field and pull together into a semblance of order, or just at least answer the questions at the end. So without further ado, I hand over to you, and thank you very much, Rosie.
Thank you. Right, I'm sharing my screen now, so apologies. Delay, and I shall just run the slideshow there, and I shall get rid of myself. Right. Thank you for joining me about this talk about portrait prints in the National Portrait Gallery collection. I confess that I'm not an expert on Lutyens, so any connections I hope that you will draw my own attention to at the end of the talk, and I hope there will be some. I'm not just going to talk about the period that Lutyens was working. I actually sort of extend through the whole 20th century, but yeah, Nicholson definitely features. So I'm going to focus on 20th century prints in the National Portrait Gallery's collection as a lens through which to explore the printmaking revival. Beginning in the 19th century, the printmaking revival looked back to traditional techniques such as etching. It also stimulated immense creativity in printmaking throughout the century, leading to innovation and technological advances. In this talk, I hope to demonstrate the diversity and depth of the National Portrait Gallery's print holdings, all of which, for conservation reasons, are usually only displayed occasionally. So it's a real privilege to be able to talk about these prints this evening, as they are old friends to me, whom I haven't seen for far too long, like so many of our friends at the moment. This is one of my favourite works in the collection, Leon Underwood's self-portrait etching. Here he is shown aged 30, made after he served in World War I as a camouflage artist, and the year he founded his own art school at Brook Green. Underwood shows himself deep in concentration, pipe clamped between teeth. His intensely observed face and figure is thrown into relief by the delicately rendered pastoral scene beyond. This portrait is an etching where a design drawn into a soft ground is bitten into a metal plate with acid before printing. Original prints can be very effective vehicles for portraiture, which I hope this talk will demonstrate, and artists have exploited its diverse techniques in attempting to convey their sitter's personality. With self-portraits such as this, artists are at liberty to experiment with the medium. Here, Underwood is trying a variety of lines and marks, whilst being a very self-assured presentation. The collection includes portrait prints in a variety of techniques, and the diversity of the National Portrait Gallery's collection can be demonstrated by some very interesting examples of dry point, wood engraving, screen printing, and etching. And here's an example of a dry point from 1951, another self-portrait by Thomas Harris. A dry point is like an etching. The drawing makes an incision into a metal plate, but it leaves a slightly more burr to the edges, when the plate comes into contact with acid. So it's a slightly softer effect. Harris, the artist of this portrait, was actually an amateur artist, but a professional art dealer, but also an MI6 officer and an important double agent for Britain in World War II. So very fascinating and slightly ambiguous portrait. This is a wood engraving by Albert Garrett from 1976. Albert Garrett became president of the Society of Wood Engravers, and the qualities of the medium, even the grain of wood itself, have been exploited to create a dynamic, abstracted portrait. And here is a screen print representing Mahatma Gandhi by Jacob Kramer, a Ukrainian-born artist associated with the Vorticist movement. So screen printing is a stenciling technique where several stencils can be applied to a mesh screen and ink or paint is brushed across. It might be worth mentioning or interjecting here with a moment to consider the National Portrait Gallery's collecting policy and purpose. For those who aren't familiar with it, the remit is to collect portraits of those who have made a significant impact on British history and culture. And many of the works in the collection represent international figures, such as Gandhi, whose inclusion recognises his impact on British culture and the end of the British Empire, as well as his time spent in the UK. We do have occasional examples of unknown sitters, which are useful to have in a collection as examples of the genre of portraiture. So here's a really lovely Cornish fisherman, so an unidentified gentleman, by Alfred Hartley from the early 20th century, which is an etching. So we're going right back here. The National Portrait Gallery has been collecting prints since its earliest years. It was founded in 1856, and this is the first print to be catalogued in its collection, incidentally representing the same sitter as the gallery's first painting it ever acquired, William Shakespeare. This is by Martin Draushout, a 17th century print, and it was purchased by the gallery in 1864. The gallery has a large primary collection of prints, which is the sort of notch prints. Also has 80,000 prints in its reference collection, some of which are absolutely fantastic as well. So this talk is really only touching the tip of the iceberg of the collection. Before we move on, we should also take a moment to consider the circumstances for a revival in printmaking techniques, which actually sort of coincided with the foundation of the National Portrait Gallery, and also the development of photography as an alternative medium of representation. So this, for example, is a Kramer lithograph made in 1863, and it's based on a photograph of Princess Alexandra before she was Queen Alexandra, actually, in her wedding dress. The originator of the MPG collection of portrait prints is the gallery's first director, Sir George Schaff, who acquired large numbers of prints as primary iconographical resources, so not really as works of art in their own right. He chose them to record likenesses of specific people and to provide visual evidence for the existence of portraits, painted portraits. And so it was this very notion of a print as a reproduction of something else, another work of art, an illustration of a painting, or even after a photograph, which began to be challenged by a new generation of printmakers who valued the qualities of traditional techniques, initially etching, to make original, inventive works of art in small editions. So by the late 19th century, printmaking had become an industrial business, mechanized thanks to developments in print types such as this Kramer lithograph, also color types, photogravure, and they were mass produced. So what we're looking at is an alternative to that mass production. This is a lovely etching of Alphonse Legros by William Stang. What came out strongly when thinking about this talk and its focus on the National Portrait Gallery holdings are the relationships between the artist and the sitter, particularly the notion of master and pupil. This is particularly true in the first decades of the century, where a network of masters, students, and associates worked together, influenced one another, and became the subjects of each other's portraits. This etching by William Strang shows his former teacher, Alphonse Legros, made in 1913, 2 years after Legros' death, so it's actually a memorial portrait. Legros was a French artist associated with the Impressionists. He was very influential on a generation of British art students, and he is largely responsible for the revival of etching in this country, which had been declining for over a century. He came to England on the advice of the artist James Abbott McNeill Whistler in 1863, and by 1875 was put in charge of the etching class at the Royal College of Art, and later became Professor of Fine Art at the Slade School of Arts in London. Here is a portrait of Sir Charles Hollingroyd by Legros. Hollingroyd was a painter and director of the National Gallery, and this portrait reveals Legros' commitment to psychological intensity, which really characterizes his work. This is another portrait of Legros by Deleuze. It's obviously not a print, but the breadth of the portrait gallery collection allows us to compare representations of sitters across different media. As I have mentioned, the Strang etching of Legros is rarely shown. This bust by Deleuze is usually on display in the galleries. And in a way, therefore, this masterful bronze represents the public face of the influential artist, and this etching is more intimate and informal. And that is one of the most valuable qualities of original prints as portraits, I think. We also have this fascinating photograph of Legros in the collection, and I think it demonstrates that it's likely that Strang's image is based on a photograph like this, possibly this one, but Strang's etching is not a slavish copy, coming over as an affectionate homage to a respected master. Here we have two portraits also by Strang, a self-portrait and a really amazing portrait of Rudyard Kipling, the writer. Strang was born in Dumbarton, Scotland, and he became Legros' massier, which means his master student. Legros relied on his best students to help teach, as he never actually learned English. Strang himself became a prolific printmaker, producing 751 etchings and engravings between 1880 and 1920. The self-portrait on the left was actually printed by Strang's son David, and many Strang works in the Portrait Gallery collection are made this way, etched by Strang and printed by his son. Again, another example of a master-pupil relationship, this time within one family. The Kipling portrait on the right was a frontispiece to a set of etchings and aquatints illustrating Kipling's short stories, published in bound portfolios by Macmillan. It is an inventive portrait showing Kipling as puppeteer to his fictional characters. Here are two further portraits of Kipling by Strang, which are instructive in showing how Strang worked up to a more complex finished etching. So on the left, you have a drawing, and then on the right, you have a version of the etching, which he incorporated with the cast of characters which you see in the other etching. And I think that Strang's portrait of Kipling anticipates this much later portrait of H.G. Wells, another writer, of a writer with a sense of his own work made for publication. It's a vortices-inspired portrait, and the artist Stefan Mrozewski is a Polish artist, and it was made for Time and Tide magazine in the 1930s. This coloured drawing, it's chalk and watercolour, represents the master printmaker David Osborne standing in front of his desk, his magnifying glass and other equipment, and it actually represents him quite late in his career in the late 1950s. Osborne was head of etching and engraving at the Royal College of Art from 1924. And the next set of portraits I'm going to share illustrate further this kind of master-pupil relationship, which is so strong in the prints in our collection. So this is Sir Frank Short by David Osborne, who was the sitter in the last portrait. This masterful etched portrait was made much earlier in Osborne's career, representing his teacher, Sir Frank Short. Osborne had trained under Short and succeeded him as head of etching at the Royal College 6 years prior to this portrait being made. And it's a tribute portrait, which also marks the passing on of the master's baton. Short is another key figure in the printmaking revival. He devoted much of his career to reviving the mezzotint technique, primarily to make prints after Turner's paintings. In addition to writing popular books on printmaking, he helped arrange the British Engraving and Etching Exhibition at the V&A in 1903, which included relevant tools and materials to help educate the public on printmaking. This is a lovely print of Stanley Lawrence by Anne Jope, and it's a wood engraving. This is a tribute to a collaborator, showing a third-generation boxwood block maker, Stanley Lawrence. So what you see here is the block would be made for wood engravings, wood prints. The Lawrence family had made wood blocks for William Nicholson, Eric Gill, and Eric Grevilius. This print was included in a memorial book of Tales from Bleeding Heart Yard about Stanley Lawrence. And although prints can have an intimate, personal quality, their printing could potentially be rather sociable, involving several different people in their process. So we can see that Anne Jope potentially made friends with the block maker, and often other people printed original engravings and prints. This is much earlier. This is a portrait of William Booth, founder of the Salvation Army, by Francis Dodd. Dodd was also a prolific printmaker, and he's a key figure in developing etching in England. Some of his best works are his series of portraits of other artists, some of which are in the National Portrait Collection. There is a full set of these prints in the Ashmolean. Here are two of his friend, representing his friend Randolph Schwabe, the Lancashire-born artist who became Professor of Fine Art at the Slade in 1930. And here is a portrait of Dodd by Schwabe, made in the same year. So it's possible that these prints, the last prints we've seen here and this one, were sort of made as reciprocal tokens of friendship. I think we can agree with the art historian Steve Bone's assessment that Schwabe's prints are not remarkable for their imagination, but are beautifully precise and reasonable statements of fact. That was a quote. Stephen Bone's father is the printmaker and painter Sir Muirhead Bone, who is shown here in two prints by Dodd. These are interesting examples to have in the collection, showing the same print in Dodd's studio. So Bone appears to get dressed, put his jacket on, and it becomes a more formal portrait. This portrait represents Wyndham Lewis by Augustus John. Several impressions can be made from one plate, and as a consequence, the collection sometimes includes two impressions made from the same plate. Here, two versions of John's portrait of a young Wyndham Lewis, one in the gallery's primary and one in the reference collection, are slightly different. Another example of an artist portraying an artist, perhaps because another artist is not only a friend, but also a sympathetic sitter when exploring technique and also as a sounding board for sharing ideas. Augustus John Stang had been taught by Le Gros and was also influenced in his printmaking by historical precedents, particularly Rembrandt. This portrait represents Stanley Anderson and is another self-portrait. Bristol-born artist Stanley Anderson was also influenced by historical precedents. This is a line engraving, a design drawn with a tool called a burin directly onto a plate, which is pressed against paper. So this print doesn't involve the use of acid. Anderson revived line engraving as a means of, and I quote, original graphic expression when it was almost obsolete as practice. Although Anderson studied under Sir Frank Short at the Royal College of Art, he was undoubtedly influenced by his father, a professional engraver on glass and silverware, to whom he had been apprenticed as a teenager. Anderson learned to write and design on objects such as metal tankards with exacting precision. This clarity of line is evident in this self-portrait, conveying a definitive statement of purpose. Anderson portrays himself in his smock with his tools, and the pose is derived from Renaissance examples, which you may be familiar with, such as this lovely portrait of Rembrandt, self-portrait, and also Dürer, the painting by Dürer, self-portrait on the left, and Holler's engraving after the self-portrait, which no doubt Anderson and John would have been familiar with. Here's something quite different. This is a portrait of Thomas Esmond Lewinsky by Eric Gill from 1924, and this is a wood engraving. Sculptor and printmaker Eric Gill, a leading British modernist artist, uses quite different historical precedents in his portrait of proto-surrealist painter Thomas Lewinsky, The Silhouette. And I'll show some possible inspirations. Developed in the 18th century, initially as paper cutouts, but then widely incorporated in mass-produced prints in the 19th century, often in memorial images. Gill's Silhouette may also be a witty reference to the continued popularity of the medium in the 20th century. And on the right, you can see some holiday makers in Brighton made by Hubert Leslie, also in the Portrait Gallery's collection. And also, since Gill was a sculptor, he was used to thinking in 3 dimensions. So he no doubt also had in mind making his silhouette relief carving on medals and medallions. The sitter's formal dress, stylized composition and dominance of the black tone work together to conceal aspects of the sitter's psychology, quite different to the approach of earlier artists such as Legros and John. Gill trained under the calligrapher and stonemason Edward Johnston, who is famously the designer of the types used on the London Underground, and whose influence is apparent in the purity and severity of this work. And here's a self-portrait of the artist, wearing his familiar hat. One of my favourite portrait prints in the collection is this etching showing the poet Edward Thomas, and it's one of the few examples of a printed portrait in this talk which does not show another artist. We, the printmaker, studied at the Slade and was appointed a war artist during World War I. In this portrait, he shows Thomas in his corporal's uniform, chewing the end of his pen as though in the act of composition. The quiet, solitary nature of the poet's creative process is very sensitively rendered in this small print, which is particularly poignant as it was made the year Thomas died, killed by a shell blast in Arras. As I've shown with portraits of Legros, the MPG often holds a number of representations of the same sitter. So another portrait of Thomas by Robin Craig Guthrie, another Slade student. This work is interesting as it is a lino cut, a technique comparable to a woodcut, which was developed in the 20th century. Thomas, the poet, was already well known as a critic and poet before going to war, inspired by rural England. And this print is likely to be a memorial image, possibly made soon after Thomas's death. He's not depicted in uniform, unlike the other portrait, but rather on a walk, and he appears to glance back as he walks away. This portrait is a self-portrait etching by Derwent Lee, who is an Australian artist. It may be based on an original drawing, but it seems more likely that he is actually making his design directly onto the prepared plate he appears to hold as he looks in a mirror. And it is the shape of the plate that we can see impressed on the paper in this example. Like the artists of the portraits of Edward Thomas, Lee studied at the Slade, and like those previous portraits, this work is also very poignant. This direct image self-portrait was made a year before Lee's suffered a breakdown and was committed to an asylum. Here's another self-portrait showing the artist Edgar Holloway, made in 1931. Holloway was a self-taught printmaker who made more self-portraits than any other British printmaker, 33 etched works in total, made between 1931 and 2002. This work is based on an original drawing, and this is a sort of very technically virtuosi etched portrait. It was first reproduced in the art magazine The Studio in 1932. The Studio was a supporter of contemporary printmakers, producing folio editions of contemporary printmakers' work, which focused on Laura Knight, a prolific printmaker whose printmaking is sadly not yet represented in the National Portrait Gallery's collection. The National Portrait Gallery made a small display of Holloway's prints in 2011. Holloway had taken a 20-year break from making prints following World War II, but his powers remained undiminished, and the display included this etching of fellow sculptor Henry Moore, made in 1978, which I think you'll agree is remarkable. And here's a really lovely photograph of Holloway himself in 1996, shown at his printing press. Where are the women, you may ask? Well, here's one. This is Gertrude Hermes. It's a self-portrait, and it's possibly a wood or a lino cut. Sometimes it's actually quite difficult to tell. Hermes studied at the Brook Green Art School, founded by Leon Underwood, whose self-portrait with the pipe I showed at the beginning of this talk. She herself became a master of wood engraving. Very inventive. Like Eric Gill, Gertrude Hermes was a sculptor also, which may contribute to her technical dexterity and also her ability to visualize form in planes. Here are some examples of Hermes' sculpture in the National Portrait Gallery collection, including P.L. Travers, author of Mary Poppins. The gallery has yet to acquire examples of work by many significant women printmakers, such as Claire Leighton, and this may be because some of them did not really focus on portraiture. But we do have some nice examples of female printmakers, including Flora Lyon. This is Isabella, Lady Gregory, made in 1913. The graph is a drawing onto a smoothed limestone slab made in a greasy medium, such as crayon. The stone is then dampened, and the greasy areas repel the water but attract the ink. And this allows a really sort of free line when you're making a drawing. And here's another print by a woman showing Barnett Friedman, the designer, but he's shown in battle dress, and it was made during World War II. And here is our old friend Ben Nicholson, amazing portrait of Queen Victoria, which is a woodcut. However, this is not an original woodcut. This is a lithograph after a woodcut. And Ben Nicholson emerged as a woodcut artist in the 1890s and helped repopularize the medium throughout the next century. Here is one of his most famous portraits showing Queen Victoria exploiting the stark white background that emphasizes the figure. Unfortunately, the Portrait Gallery has no examples of Nicholson's original woodcut prints, only these lithographic reproductions made by the publisher Heinemann, which were made subsequently for wider distribution. I'm just going to show you some later examples of portrait prints from the collection. Here we have a photograph of Oscar Kokoschka, fantastic picture by Lee Miller, also in the Portrait Gallery's collection. This photograph shows Oscar Kokoschka in his studio. Born in Vienna, Kokoschka lived in Dresden and Prague before moving to London in 1938. And apart from the portrait of Le Gros, he is the only European-born artist represented in this talk. And here is his self-portrait lithograph. Kokoschka had been branded a degenerate artist by the Nazis, and this 1965 self-portrait is reminiscent of the self-portrait painting Kokoschka made in response, which he entitled Portrait of a Degenerate Artist. And both works are invested with a spirit of defiance, The vigorous vertical strokes suggest energy, but as they contained in a stoic and dignified body. Here's another lovely photograph of an artist in their studio, Julian Trevelyan by Sandra Lusada, made in 1960. And here is a late portrait by Trevelyan. It's a coloured etching combined with aquatint. Trevelyan had studied in Paris at the printmaking workshop Atelier 17, where his classmates included not only Kokoschka, but Picasso, Miro, and Max Ernst. This self-portrait showing the artist at his home beside the Thames at Hammersmith demonstrates his invention as a printmaker, his linear style, and also his use of texture. Here's another portrait, self-portrait by Trevelyan, showing him with his wife, the painter Mary Fedden, which is another sort of landscape portrait. This is something quite different. This is a portrait of Lucian Freud by Frank Auerbach. It's an etching made in 1981. Where Trevelyan's portraits are expansive, identifying himself with his environment, Auerbach chooses to isolate his friend and fellow artist Lucian Freud by intensely overlaying drawings of the same head on a plain background using 4 different printing plates. In making a portrait, Auerbach was aiming to make something unfamiliar and unknowable. And again, you see this approach in this self-portrait drawing. Like his predecessor, Francis Dodd, Auerbach undertook a series of printed portraits of fellow artists, which are also in the gallery's collection. So here we have Joe Tilson, Leon Kossoff, and R.B. Kittai. Moving on to something else quite different, it's a combined silkscreen and collotype self-portrait of Richard Hamilton. Produced in the year of Hamilton's first museum retrospective at the Tate Gallery, London, this self-portrait is one of a series of studies entitled Portrait of the Artist by Francis Bacon. Using a rejected photograph of Hamilton taken by Francis Bacon, he used screen printing to interpret Bacon's painting, distorting his own features to mimic Bacon's characteristic brushwork, and it's a kind of homage or tribute to Bacon within a self-portrait. In turn, in this portrait, one of the more recent master printmakers, David Hockney, pays tribute to Hamilton, who he saw as a kind of mentor teacher. So this is harking back to the Legros, Stang, Osborne, Short, master student or master friend relationship that we have already seen. Now, this is a very different type of work. It's a self-portrait by Michael Rothenstein, and you can see there's a sort of square section at the bottom, which does show a representation of his face. It's a woodcut. Rothenstein was a leading figure in the renaissance of British printmaking after World War II as a maker and a teacher. Rothenstein had a distinguished artistic pedigree. He was son of the painter, printmaker, and principal of College of Art, Sir Rothenstein, and his elder brother was Sir John Rothenstein, director of the Tate Gallery. Like Trevelyan, he studied at the print studio Atelier 17 in Paris. And from the 1960s, his work became increasingly abstract, and here he combines an abstract background with a portrait derived from a photograph. Frustrated by resources available to printmakers in Britain, he bought his own press and experimented with planks, corroded iron, saying, quote, anything you could coat with ink could be used to make a print. And I think this radical approach may not be immediately apparent in this very formal photograph where he is shown with Sir John Sir William Rothenstein, which is also in the gallery's collection. But actually his face in this portrait is very similar to the face represented in the print. This injection of colour continues with this coloured etching representing the boxer Frank Bruno. Wood shows Bruno with a victor's wreath of laurels, and by focusing on the head, he draws attention to the future champion's psychology rather than his physical strength, which was what usually preoccupied photographers working with athletes, exemplified by this example of a portrait of Bruno by Snowdon that we also have in the collection. Now, this is obviously something quite different, a group portrait by Chris Orr. It represents the House of Commons. So from these intensely personal works of artists depicting other artists or masters, this work by Chris Orr represents a group. It's an incredibly detailed aquatint and etching with individual portraits picked out. It represents a specific moment in 1986 when a Guardian newspaper was thrown at Margaret Thatcher. But it has historical precedent in similarly ambitious paintings in the National Portrait Gallery collection, which you may be familiar with, such as the House of Commons, painted in 1833 by Sir George Hayter, and also in early prints, which is a 1749 view of the House of Commons. But Chris Orr's work is gently satirical, recalling the craze for satire in prints distributed in the individual sheets, which began in the 18th century by the artists Hogarth, Gilray, and Rowlandson. So back to Leon Underwood and conclusion. Portraiture has been a thread running throughout the printmaking revival from its beginnings in the late 19th century through to its post-war renaissance, providing artists new means by which to explore identity, theirs and others. I find the reciprocal nature of portraiture printmaking particularly intriguing as gestures of friendship or as tributes to other artists, often as a consequence of the master-pupil relationship, which has its roots in the craft tradition and the handing on of traditional skills. A respect for the past is evident in many of these prints, which make a nod to old masters through subject matter and composition. I hope I've been able to demonstrate this evening the range and breadth of the 20th century print holdings at the National Portrait Gallery. And I also hope that in the years after the gallery reopens, because it's currently closed for refurbishment, so it's not opening again until 2023, that it will be possible to display some of these examples for you to see in real life or to view by appointment in our store.
Rosie, well, thank you very much indeed. As you rightly say, it gave an incredible insight to the well, snapshot really of the 80,000 odd reference or images that you have to do. So what you have managed to condense there in 40 minutes has been phenomenal and has taught me so much more about this amazing form of art, both in the techniques available and I think, you know, in seeing that evolution from the end of the 19th century through to those very, very striking modern images, of course it's very easy to then reflect on how important that evolution is to people's work. I mean, you know, whether it's of course seeing how those different trends might have affected Lutyens' work architecturally, equally it's just as important to see how artists respond to that. And I suppose whilst hopefully people will come and put questions in there, what were sort of common threads that perhaps led certain artists to sort of group around? I mean, if one was to perhaps take early 20th century, mid 20th century, and then and latter 20th century, are there common threads that sort of created these nexus of artists, or was it rather broader?
Well, I think that what does come across is this kind of reaction to modernity, be it a reaction against modernity or embracing it. But there's definitely, and I suppose it harks back a little bit to the arts and crafts movement, this idea of craft and making things that are unique and not mass produced. And I think that was definitely something that united many of these artists. But also it kind of led to kind of radical experiments as well. I think we saw in some of the, particularly the woodcuts, the artists also kind of embraced modernity in terms of abstracted portraits and kind of portraits that kind of reminiscent of or were part of the vorticist movement or that kind of thing. So yeah, I do think it has its roots in craft very much, which is, I suppose, has its connections with Lutyens and his approach and contemporaries. So yeah, it sits slightly aside from sort of what was in painting and sculpture at the time, I think.
But I think it doesn't matter what area you look at, there's always parallels one can find in what contemporaries are doing, different reactions to the techniques. As you said at the beginning, there was a resurgence in the traditional techniques of printing. There was there was a reaction to then against that perhaps older way of looking at things, of trying to create something more radical. It's the same thing that happens in writing. It's the same thing that happens in architecture. But what's interesting this evening is by actually extending it further on than just looking at the artists immediately around Lutyens, we start to be able to sort of take some of those trends and see how far it obviously went along the way. One of the questions we've had is about Lutyens and Nicholson, and perhaps are you able to expand a little bit more about Nicholson and his artistic influences and his printmaking?
Not hugely, I have to say.
Or perhaps more of that sort of, just perhaps explaining a bit more about that resurgence at the beginning of the 20th century in terms of where people were taking their inspiration. What had caused that reaction to come back to the more...
Well, I mean, yeah, it's very much rooted in newspapers and the beginnings of how newspapers and illustrated magazines became incredibly popular, and the types of reproductions that they used, and it's also to do with photography. I think the development of photography, particularly in portraiture, because when photography first developed, it was not actually very democratic. It would be something that was still like portrait painting, reserved for the elite, but very quickly, as technology advanced, portrait photographs became widely available in postcards, and everybody had them. So artists like Nicholson would be thinking about portraiture in the way that we do, I think, now that selfies have become sort of everywhere. What a portrait can do in the hands of an artist becomes something quite different. So Queen Victoria, for example, was the most photographed person and is still one of the most photographed sort of individuals of all time. Probably not now, but she was 20 years ago. And so Nicholson is clearly trying to do something quite different to what the photographers that were doing with Victoria, and indeed what anyone painting her was doing, which would have been a much more formal thing. He's turning her into a kind of a sort of old lady you'd see walking around Kensington Gardens. I think there she is with her dog. There's a kind of, he is democratizing Queen Victoria through that portrait. I think some think it's quite cheeky or disrespectful, perhaps, but I don't think it is. I think it's quite affectionate, but it is very informal, which is something quite new.
But I that's absolutely fascinating, and I think what you say there of the perception and characterization of people is something that comes through so wonderfully in those images. I mean, often the portraits themselves tell something about the person, but as you touched on so many lovely examples, what actually happens in the background can actually be as interesting. And I think that also is an amazing... Or doesn't. And seeing that. another
Nicholson has that amazing graphic clarity.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So no, it's a slight
internet slow connection.
I've got one other question at the moment, which is more back to actually sort of how the MPG works. When you have when more than one print is taken from the same plate, or from the same plate exists, how do you decide which should be the primary piece? Does that make, if you've got lots of pieces, lots of...
Well, yeah. Yeah, I think, you know, you have this concept of the artist proof and out at the beginning. And that's the interesting thing about those different states of the prints, that you can make a print and then think that it's not actually how you want it to be, and you can carry on working on the plate. So but the print that you've made is a record of the print at the moment. Like we saw the portrait where he had his jacket off, and then a later state where the print plate itself was worked on more, is a later. So that's sort of showing the artist process and progress. But I think, you know, there must be lots of discarded prints before you reach the sort of moment that is right. You know, too much ink, too little ink. It's been done too many times. The plate becomes worn out. We've actually just been given an amazing archive of Lucian Freud, and that includes some of his own etching plates. And those are the examples we'll have in the collection of the plate themselves. So we've only just received the gift, so it requires some research, but will be really beneficial in helping to demonstrate and illustrate how prints work, because it's quite complicated, and every print type is very different, as was demonstrated, I think, in the diversity of the examples that I was able to show this evening.
Yeah,
in a sort of whistle-stop way.
It was absolutely phenomenal. I'm conscious of time, and Rosie, you have given much of it. A huge thank you for a really amazing talk this evening. I think everyone, if we could join in around the room, I'm sure there'll be a huge round of applause, such as the joys of webinars. Sadly, we miss out on that. But if I can take a collective thank you from everyone who has been here this evening, thank you so much for your time, for your amazing insights, and for such a fantastic lecture. It really is a joy to see it, and I can't wait to be able to come and explore it further. And for those members who are potentially interested in seeing more, as Rosie said, that there is the ability to book in to see the archives in due course, and indeed we may well look to see whether we can't organise a trip there as members, to see whether we can't pull together some of these paintings contemporary to Lutyens as well, or prints rather contemporary to Lutyens. So watch that space. It's formed more ideas for events, and
definitely,
if members have ideas, then please do get in touch. So I think it remains for me to say one final thank you, and thank you to everyone who's joined, and hope to see you all at future events. Thank you.